Sophia Pearson was 21 years old when the bear trap closed around her leg. And in that moment of white-hot agony, she understood that the wilderness did not care about her dreams, her plans, or the life she thought she would live. The iron teeth bit through fabric and flesh, and her scream shattered the silence of the Colorado forest like glass breaking against stone. She was 3 miles from the nearest settlement, alone except for the circling ravens and the distant howl of wolves. And as the pain dragged her toward darkness, she wondered if anyone would even find her body before winter came. The morning had started with such promise. Sophia had left Fort Collins before dawn, her saddlebag packed with sketching supplies and enough provisions for a day's journey into the foothills. She was a naturalist, one of the few women brave enough or foolish enough to document the wild places of the Colorado Territory in 1876. Her father had been a botanist before. Consumption took him, and her mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving Sophia with nothing but her father's journals and an inheritance too small to live on without working. She had come west from Boston 2 years ago, determined to finish her father's unfinished work cataloging the plant species of the Rocky Mountains. The university men back east had laughed at her letters requesting funding, and the frontier towns treated her like a curiosity, a well-bred woman playing at science while real men tamed the land. But Sophia had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his love of the natural world, and she refused to let anyone's doubt stop her from doing the work that mattered. The trap had been hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles, set by some trapper who had either abandoned his line or forgotten this location. Sophia had been following a game trail, looking for a particular species of wild orchid her father had mentioned in his notes, but never properly documented. She had been so focused on the vegetation, so absorbed in her search, that she never saw the danger until her boot came down on the trigger plate and the jaws snapped shut with the force of a lightning strike. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined pain could be. It radiated up from her trapped leg in waves that made her vision blur and her stomach heave. She collapsed onto the forest floor, her hands clawing at the iron jaws, but they were designed to hold a 200-pound wolf or a mountain lion, and her fingers were no match for the spring mechanism. Blood soaked through her torn skirt, dark and frightening against the brown fabric. She tried to pry the trap open, tried to find the release mechanism, but her hands were shaking too badly and the pain made it impossible to think clearly. Sophia's horse had bolted at her scream, disappearing into the trees with all her supplies still strapped to the saddle. She called after the animal, her voice breaking with desperation, but the horse was long gone, driven by the same primal fear that made all creatures flee from the smell of blood and suffering. The forest seemed to close in around her, the tall pines casting shadows that grew longer as the sun moved across the sky. She was alone with her agony, and every moment that passed made her situation more desperate. She tried to drag herself toward the trail, thinking that perhaps someone might pass by, some hunter or traveler who could help her. But the trap was chained to a stake driven deep into the ground, and she could barely move an inch before the pain became unbearable. Her leg felt like it was on fire, like the iron teeth were grinding against bone with every slight movement. Tears streamed down her face, and she tasted salt and dirt as she pressed her cheek against the cool earth, trying to find some relief from the torment. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time became meaningless when measured only in waves of pain. Sophia's mind began to wander, slipping between consciousness and delirium. She thought of her father, of the way he used to hold her hand while they walked through the gardens behind their Boston home, teaching her the Latin names of flowers. She thought of the dreams she had harbored, the book she wanted to write, the recognition she hoped to earn. All of it seemed so far away now, so impossibly distant from this reality of blood and iron and the indifferent wilderness. The sun was past its zenith when she heard the footsteps. At first she thought it was another hallucination, her mind conjuring rescue because it could not accept the alternative. But then she heard the soft crunch of boots on pine needles, the deliberate pace of someone moving through the forest with purpose and caution. She tried to lift her head, tried to call out, but her throat was raw from screaming, and only a weak moan escaped her lips. Black Wolf had been tracking an elk herd when he noticed the ravens circling. In Comanche tradition, ravens were messengers, creatures that moved between the world of the living and the world of spirits, and their gathering always meant something significant. He changed direction, following the birds toward a part of the forest where white trappers sometimes set their cruel steel jaws. His people had lost friends and relatives to such traps, had seen strong warriors crippled by the indiscriminate violence of metal teeth that could not distinguish between a wolf and a human being. He was 30 years old, a hunter and scout who moved between the Comanche world of his mother and the white world of his father. His mother had named him Black Wolf for the dark hair and the fierce spirit he showed even as an infant. His father, a fur trader named William Cross, had called him by the white name Thomas, but that name had died along with his father when winter fever swept through the trading post 15 years ago. Black Wolf had chosen to live among his mother's people, to learn the old ways that were rapidly disappearing as more whites flooded into the territory. When he found Sophia, his first thought was that she was already dead. She lay so still, her face pale beneath the dirt and tears, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle in the trap's grip. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, heard the faint moan that escaped her lips, and he moved quickly to her side. His dark eyes took in the situation instantly, the trap, the blood, the hours of suffering written in every line of her exhausted face. Sophia's eyes fluttered open at his approach, and for a moment she thought she was seeing a vision, some spirit of the forest come to guide her into death. The man who knelt beside her had long black hair bound with leather cord, copper skin that spoke of sun and heritage, and eyes that held both strength and an unexpected gentleness. He wore buckskin clothing and moccasins, with a knife at his belt and a rifle slung across his back. Everything about him spoke of the wild places, of a life lived in harmony with the land rather than in conquest of it. Black Wolf spoke first in Comanche, a prayer of healing that his grandmother had taught him. Words meant to calm the spirit and prepare it for what must be done. Then he switched to English, his voice low and steady, accented but clear. The pain will get worse before it gets better. I need to open the trap, and when I do, you will want to scream. That is good. Scream if you need to. But you must stay still, you must not pull away, or I cannot help you. Sophia tried to focus on his face, on the calm certainty in his eyes. She managed to nod, though the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. Please, just do it. I cannot bear this much longer. Black Wolf placed one hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and also restraint. With his other hand, he found the release mechanism on the trap, the small lever that most people never noticed in their panic. He looked into Sophia's eyes, holding her gaze with his own. Breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. When I say now, you breathe out, and I will open the trap. Do you understand? She nodded again, and despite everything, despite the agony and the fear and the delirium, she found herself following his instructions. She breathed in, feeling her lungs expand, and then she breathed out, releasing the air in a slow stream. Black Wolf counted with her, his voice a steady rhythm in the chaos of her pain. 1, 2, 3, now. The trap opened with a metallic snap that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Sophia's scream tore through the air, raw and primal, as the iron teeth released their grip and blood flowed freely from the wounds. The pain intensified to a level she had not thought possible, and her vision went white, then black, then white again. She felt Black Wolf's hands on her leg, strong and sure, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. His voice cut through the haze, commanding her attention. Stay with me. Do not go into the darkness. I know it calls to you, but you must stay here, in this moment, in this pain. It means you are alive. Stay with me." Sophia clung to his voice like a drowning woman clinging to a rope. She forced her eyes to focus on his face, on the concentration written there, as he worked to save her leg and possibly her life. She watched as he pulled a leather pouch from his belt, as he sprinkled something that looked like dried herbs into the wounds. The mixture stung worse than anything she had ever felt, and fresh tears streamed down her face, but she did not look away from him. Black Wolf worked with the efficiency of someone who had treated such injuries before. He knew that time was the enemy now, that infection could kill as surely as blood loss, that shock could stop a heart even after the immediate danger had passed. He pulled strips of clean cloth from his pack, binding her leg tightly to slow the bleeding and stabilize the injury. His hands moved with practiced precision, and all the while he kept talking to her, keeping her conscious, keeping her fighting. "You are strong. I can see it in your eyes. You did not give up, even when you were alone, even when you thought no one would come. That strength will save you now, but you must use it. You must fight through this pain, through the fear, through the darkness that wants to take you. Can you do that?" Sophia found her voice again, though it was weak and trembling. "I can try. I do not know if I am strong enough, but I will try. That is all anyone can do. Try, and then try again, and keep trying until the trying becomes living. My grandmother told me that pain is the body's way of reminding us we are still connected to this world. Feel the pain, acknowledge it, but do not let it defeat you." Once he had bandaged her leg as well as he could in the field, Black Wolf assessed their situation. The light was fading, and he knew they could not make it back to any settlement before dark. Sophia had lost too much blood to travel far, and moving her carelessly could restart the bleeding or worsen the injury. He would need to make camp here, to build a fire and keep watch through the night, to monitor condition and hope that infection did not set in before morning. He left her briefly to gather firewood and to scout the immediate area for threats. When he returned, he found her exactly as he had left her, lying still but awake, her eyes following him as he moved about preparing their camp. He built the fire close enough to provide warmth, but far enough that sparks would not reach her. As the flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor, he finally allowed himself to wonder about this white woman who had been alone in the wilderness with nothing but her courage and her foolishness. Sophia watched him work, noting the quiet competence with which he transformed a dangerous situation into something almost manageable. She had heard stories about Indians, about savages and violence, and all the fears that white settlers carried with them into the frontier. But this man who had saved her life showed none of the characteristics those stories described. Instead, she saw someone who understood the land in ways she could only dream of. Someone who moved through the wilderness as if he belonged there in a way she never would. As darkness fell completely and the fire became their only light, Black Wolf settled near her, close enough to respond if her condition worsened, but respectful of the space between them. He pulled dried meat from his pack and offered her some, but she shook her head, her stomach still too unsettled from pain and shock to accept food. He nodded understanding and ate his own portion slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them. The distant howl of wolves, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Sophia found the sounds frightening and comforting in equal measure, reminding her that life continued all around them, indifferent to her suffering but also proof that the world kept turning. She tried to sleep, but the pain made it impossible, and instead she lay there staring at the stars visible through the pine canopy, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Black Wolf noticed her restlessness and began to speak, his voice low and soothing, telling her about the stars and the stories his grandmother had taught him. He pointed out constellations she had never heard of, patterns that told tales of hunters and animals, and the eternal dance between earth and sky. His words washed over her like water, not quite lulling her to sleep, but easing the edge of her pain, giving her something to focus on besides the throbbing agony in her leg. Hours passed in this way, with Black Wolf keeping watch and Sophia drifting in and out of consciousness. Twice during the night her fever spiked, and she began to shake uncontrollably, and both times Black Wolf moved to her side, covering her with his own blanket and using his body to shield her from the cold. He spoke to her in Comanche, words of healing and protection, prayers that his grandmother had taught him for times when death walked close. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sophia opened her eyes to find Black Wolf adding wood to the fire, preparing for the journey they would need to make. Her leg still throbbed with steady pain, but the sharp agony had dulled to something more bearable. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the world spun and nausea rose in her throat. Black Wolf was at her side instantly, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. Slowly, "Your body has been through much. Do not ask it to do too much too soon." Sophia looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he had found her. In the growing light, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against sun and wind. The small scar on his chin, the careful way he held himself. Always balanced, always ready. She realized she did not even know his name. This stranger who had saved her life and sat vigil through the night. "I am Sophia. Sophia Pearson. I do not know how to thank you for what you have done." Black Wolf met her gaze steadily. "I am called Black Wolf among my mother's people. Among whites, some knew my father as William Cross, but that name does not belong to me. You do not need to thank me. What kind of man would I be if I walked past someone in need? Most men would have. Most men would not have known what to do, or they would have been afraid, or they simply would not have cared. Then you have known the wrong men. Where I come from, we are taught that all life is connected, that when one suffers, we all suffer. To ignore your pain would be to ignore my own humanity." Sophia felt tears welling up again, but this time they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something deeper that she could not quite name. This man, this stranger from a world so different from her own, had shown her more kindness and care than anyone in her entire life. And as the sun rose higher and Black Wolf prepared to carry her to safety, she understood that whatever happened next, whatever challenges still lay ahead, her life had been changed in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The journey back to civilization began with Black Wolf fashioning a travois from pine branches and leather cord, working with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent solving problems in the wilderness. Sophia watched through waves of pain and fever as his hands moved with practiced certainty, binding the poles together, creating a platform that would allow him to drag her without causing further injury to her damaged leg. The morning sun filtered through the pine canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor, and she found herself wondering how many miles separated them from help. Black Wolf tested the travois several times before he was satisfied with its stability. He had lined the platform with pine boughs and covered them with his own blanket to provide some cushioning against the rough journey ahead. When he finally lifted Sophia onto the makeshift stretcher, she bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. Every movement sent jolts of agony through her leg, and she tasted blood where her teeth had broken skin. Black Wolf noticed immediately, his dark eyes filled with concern. "The pain will be worse during travel. I cannot prevent that. But I can promise you that I will stop whenever you need to rest, and I will get you to safety as quickly as possible. My cousin lives at the edge of the white settlement, in a cabin between your world and mine. She has healing knowledge from both peoples. She will know what to do." Sophia managed a weak nod, not trusting her voice. She gripped the sides of the travois as Black Wolf lifted the poles and began to pull. The motion was surprisingly smooth at first, but as they moved over uneven ground, roots and rocks, Each bump and jar sent fresh waves of suffering through her body. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on breathing, on staying conscious, on not becoming a burden greater than she already was. Black Wolf moved steadily through the forest, following game trails and paths that only someone intimately familiar with the land could recognize. He had tied the travois poles to a harness across his chest and shoulders, distributing the weight in a way that allowed him to pull for hours without stopping. His body was accustomed to such labor, trained since childhood to endure hardship and distance. But even so, he felt the strain as the morning wore on, felt the burn in his muscles and the sweat soaking through his shirt. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the only sounds being the scrape of the travois poles against earth, the rustle of wind through pine needles, and Sophia's occasional sharp intake of breath when the pain became particularly intense. Black Wolf kept glancing back to check on her, noting the paleness of her skin, the way her hands trembled even when she tried to hold them still. He had seen men die from injuries less severe than hers, had watched infection claim lives that should have been saved. Time was their enemy now. By mid-morning, they had descended from the higher elevations into a valley, where aspens mixed with the pines and a clear stream cut through the landscape. Black Wolf stopped here, pulling the travois to level ground near the water. Sophia's eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she had lost consciousness. But then she opened them, focusing on his face with visible effort. "We rest here. You need water, and I need to check your bandages. The bleeding should have stopped by now, but infection is the greater danger. I will need to clean the wounds again." Sophia wanted to protest, wanted to tell him to keep moving, to get her to help as quickly as possible. But her throat was too dry and her body too exhausted to form the words. Instead, she watched as Black Wolf knelt beside the stream, filling a leather water bag and bringing it to her lips. The water was cold and clean, tasting of stone and snowmelt, and she drank deeply, feeling some small measure of strength return. Black Wolf carefully unwrapped the bandages on her leg, his face revealing nothing as he examined the wounds. The trap's teeth had left deep punctures on both sides of her calf, and the flesh around them was swollen and discolored. He could see the beginning signs of infection, the slight redness radiating from the wounds, the heat he felt when he placed his hand near the injury. He had expected this, had prepared for it. But the sight still troubled him. He pulled another pouch from his pack, this one containing a paste made from willow bark, sage, and other plants his grandmother had taught him to use. The mixture had powerful properties against infection, though applying it would cause Sophia considerable pain. He met her eyes, seeing the fear there, but also the determination. "This will hurt worse than anything yet. The medicine burns as it heals. Some of my people believe the burn drives out the evil spirits that cause sickness. White doctors might call it something different, but the result is the same. You must be strong for a few minutes more." Sophia braced herself, her hands gripping the edges of the travois until her knuckles turned white. "Do it. I would rather burn now than rot later." Black Wolf applied the paste directly to the wounds, working quickly but thoroughly. Sophia's scream echoed across the valley, startling birds from nearby trees and sending small animals fleeing into the underbrush. The pain was like nothing she had experienced before, as if someone had pressed hot coals directly against exposed nerves. Her back arched and her body convulsed, but Black Wolf held her leg steady, ensuring the medicine reached deep into the punctures. When he finished, Sophia was sobbing uncontrollably, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of agony. Black Wolf wrapped the leg in fresh bandages, then moved to sit beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. He began to speak in Comanche, his voice low and rhythmic, a song his grandmother had taught him for times of great pain. Though Sophia could not understand the words, the melody carried something soothing, something ancient and knowing. They rested there for nearly an hour while Sophia recovered enough strength to continue. Black Wolf used the time to scout the surrounding area, checking for threats and confirming their route. When he returned, he found Sophia awake and watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Tell me about your cousin. The one who will help me. What is she like?" Black Wolf settled beside the travois, his eyes distant as he considered how to answer. "Her name is Morning Dove, though she also answers to Sarah when dealing with whites. Her mother was Comanche, her father a missionary who came west to save souls and stayed because he fell in love. She learned healing from both traditions, combining the medicine ways of our people with what the white doctors know. Some call her a witch, others call her a saint. She is neither. She is simply someone who understands that suffering does not care about the color of skin or the gods we pray to. And she will help me, even though I am white." Black Wolf looked at her directly, his expression serious. "She will help you because you need help. That is all the reason she requires. My cousin does not judge by blood or heritage. She judges by need and by character. Though I will warn you, she has a sharp tongue and little patience for foolishness. You will need to follow her instructions exactly if you want to keep your leg." The words sent a chill through Sophia despite the warm sun. Until that moment, she had not fully confronted the possibility that she might lose her leg, might be crippled for life by a few seconds of carelessness in the forest. Her mind raced with implications: how she would work, how she would continue her research, how she would survive in a world that already saw her as weak simply because she was a woman. Black Wolf seemed to sense her thoughts. "Do not borrow tomorrow's troubles while today's are still unpaid. First we get you to Morning Dove, then we see what can be saved. Worrying now changes nothing, except to make your spirit heavier when it needs to be light." They resumed their journey shortly after noon, and as the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The dense forest gave way to more open terrain, rolling hills covered in prairie grass and wildflowers. In the distance, Sophia could see the smoke of cooking fires rising from what she assumed was the settlement Black Wolf had mentioned. The sight filled her with both relief and a strange sense of loss. As if leaving the wilderness meant leaving behind something important she had only just begun to understand. Black Wolf noticed her looking toward the settlement and seemed to understand her thoughts without her speaking them. "The wild places change us if we let them. They show us what we are capable of when the comforts of civilization are stripped away. You survived something that would have killed many others. That knowledge will stay with you always, even when you return to a world of walls and rules." As they drew closer to the settlement's edge, Sophia began to see individual structures. Rough cabins and corrals, people moving about their daily tasks. But Black Wolf did not head toward the main cluster of buildings. Instead, he pulled the travois along a less traveled path that led to a cabin set apart from the others, positioned at the boundary between cleared land and wild forest. Smoke rose from its chimney and a large garden spread out behind it, filled with plants both familiar and strange. A woman emerged from the cabin as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40 years old, with long black hair streaked with gray and eyes that took in everything at once. Her dress was a mixture of styles, a Comanche skirt and moccasins paired with a white woman's blouse and shawl. She looked at Black Wolf, then at Sophia on the travois, and her expression shifted from curiosity to professional concern. Black Wolf spoke to her in Comanche, explaining the situation quickly. Morning Dove listened without interrupting, her eyes already assessing Sophia's condition from a distance. When Black Wolf finished, she responded in English, her voice carrying both warmth and authority. "Bring her inside, cousin. Carefully now, the leg looks bad even from here. Girl, can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" Sophia found her voice, though it came out weaker than she intended. "Sophia Pearson. I am a naturalist from Boston. I was in the forest studying plants when I stepped in a trap." Morning Dove nodded, already moving to clear a bed near the fireplace. "A naturalist. That explains the foolishness of being alone in bear country during mating season. Intelligence and wisdom are not always companions. Well, Sophia Pearson from Boston, I hope you are ready for more pain, because what comes next will test you in ways you cannot imagine. Black Wolf carried Sophia inside and laid her gently on the bed Mourning Dove had prepared. The cabin's interior was clean and organized, with herbs hanging from the rafters to dry, shelves lined with jars and bottles.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
And a large table covered with what looked like medical instruments mixed with items Sophia did not recognize. The air smelled of sage smoke and something sweet she could not identify. Mourning Dove wasted no time on ceremony or comfort. She cut away the bandages Black Wolf had applied, her face impassive as she examined the wounds. Sophia watched the healer's expression, trying to read her fate in those dark eyes, but Mourning Dove revealed nothing. She prodded the swollen flesh, checked for breaks in the bone, tested Sophia's ability to move her toes. Each touch brought fresh agony, but Sophia bit down on the leather strap Mourning Dove had given her and refused to scream. Finally, Mourning Dove stepped back, washing her hands in a basin of water mixed with something that smelled sharp and medicinal. She looked at Black Wolf first, speaking in Comanche, then turned to Sophia. The bone is not broken, which is the first piece of good fortune. The infection has started, but has not yet taken deep root, which is the second. You will keep your leg if you do exactly as I say for the next 2 weeks. You will drink teas that taste like punishment. You will let me pack your wounds with medicines that burn like hellfire. You will rest when I say rest and move when I say move. If you argue with me, if you think you know better, if you decide that your way is superior to mine, then you will lose the leg and possibly your life. Do you understand? Sophia met the healer's gaze and saw no room for negotiation. I understand. I will do whatever you say. Good. Then we begin now. Black Wolf, I will need fresh water from the spring, not thewel. And gather more willow bark, the young branches only. This will be a long night. As Black Wolf left to complete his tasks, Mourning Dove began laying out her tools and preparations. Sophia watched, fascinated despite her pain by the mixture of methods and materials. Some items she recognized from her father's medical books, scalpels and forceps and clean bandages. Others were completely foreign, feathers and stones. Small leather pouches containing powders and dried plants. A rattle made from what looked like turtle shell. Mourning Dove noticed her interest and smiled slightly, the first softening of her stern demeanor. You are wondering if I am a healer or a witch. The answer is both and neither. I use what works, whether it comes from a white doctor's bag or my grandmother's medicine bundle. Pain does not care about our beliefs, so why should healing? Sophia managed a weak smile in return. My father was a scientist. He taught me to trust what could be proven, what could be observed and measured. But he also taught me that the world holds more mysteries than any one person can understand. Your father was wise. The greatest healers are those who know the limits of their knowledge. Now enough talking. Save your strength. What comes next will require all of it. Mourning Dove worked through the afternoon and into the evening, cleaning Sophia's wounds with solutions that burned and stung, packing them with poultices that made her cry out, despite her determination to stay silent. Black Wolf assisted when needed, holding Sophia still when the pain made her thrash, bringing fresh water and supplies as Mourning Dove requested them. The cabin filled with smoke from burning sage and cedar, and Mourning Dove chanted in Comanche while she worked. Prayers or spells or simply focus made audible. As night fell, Sophia's fever climbed higher. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices speaking around her, but unable to focus on the words. She saw her father's face, heard him reading from his journals about plants that healed and plants that poisoned. She felt her mother's presence, though she had no memory of the woman who died bringing her into the world. And through it all, she heard Black Wolf's steady voice, anchoring her to life when the fever tried to pull her away. Mourning Dove finally stepped back near midnight, exhaustion clear on her face. She looked at Black Wolf and spoke in English so Sophia could hear if she was conscious enough. "I have done what I can for now. The fever will break or it will not. The infection will retreat or it will advance. We wait and we watch and we pray to whatever gods might listen. You should rest, cousin. You have traveled far today." Black Wolf shook his head, settling into a chair beside Sophia's bed. "I will stay. If her spirit wanders in the fever dreams, she should have a familiar voice to guide her back." Mourning Dove nodded, understanding. "Then I will sleep for a few hours. Wake me if anything changes." Alone with Sophia in the quiet cabin, Black Wolf kept his vigil. He spoke to her in both Comanche and English, telling her stories his grandmother had shared, legends of healing and survival, tales of people who faced death and chose to live. He did not know if she could hear him, but he spoke anyway, because silence in the presence of suffering felt like a kind of abandonment. Sophia floated in a world of fever and shadow, hearing Black Wolf's voice as if from a great distance. The words themselves meant less than the sound of them, the steady rhythm that reminded her she was not alone, that someone was fighting for her, even as her own body fought against itself. And in that floating space between consciousness and oblivion, she made a choice. She chose to keep breathing, to keep fighting, to hold on for one more moment and then another. As dawn approached, Sophia's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes to find Black Wolf still sitting beside her, his face drawn with exhaustion but his eyes alert. When he saw her looking at him, truly seeing him and not lost in delirium, his expression softened with relief. "Welcome back. We were not certain you would return to us." Sophia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "How long? 2 days since I found you. 1 night in the forest, 1 day of travel, and this night of fever. Mourning Dove says if you survived until dawn, you would likely survive altogether." It seems she was right. Sophia tried to smile, but her face felt strange, disconnected. "Thank you. For everything. For finding me, for bringing me here, for staying. I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." Black Wolf leaned forward, his eyes serious. "There is no debt. What I did, any decent person would do. The fact that you think it requires repayment says more about the world you come from than about the actions themselves. Rest now. Mourning Dove will want to check your wounds when she wakes, and you will need your strength." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain, medicine, and slow healing. Sophia spent most of her time in Mourning Dove's cabin, her world reduced to the 4 walls, the crackling fire, and the view through the single window that looked out toward the forest. Mourning Dove changed her bandages twice daily, each time examining the wounds with clinical precision, muttering in Comanche when she was pleased with the progress and clicking her tongue when something concerned her. By the 5th day, Sophia could sit up without assistance and take small amounts of solid food. The infection had retreated under Mourning Dove's aggressive treatment, though the healer warned that danger still lurked if Sophia pushed herself too quickly. The wounds were closing but remained tender, and the muscles of her calf had weakened from disuse and trauma. Mourning Dove predicted at least 3 more weeks before Sophia could walk unassisted. And even then, she would carry a limp for months. Possibly forever. Black Wolf visited every day, arriving each morning with fresh game or fish, herbs from the forest, and news from the settlement. Sophia found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his footsteps on the porch, feeling an anticipation she did not fully understand. He would sit with her for hours, helping Mourning Dove with her work or simply keeping Sophia company while the healer tended to other patients who sought her services. On the 6th morning, Black Wolf arrived carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. He set it on the table near Sophia's bed and carefully unwrapped it, revealing her leather satchel, the one that had been strapped to her horse when the animal bolted. Inside were her sketching supplies, her father's journals, and most miraculously, her collection of pressed plant specimens, slightly damaged but mostly intact. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she reached for the satchel with trembling hands. I thought it was lost forever. How did you find it? Black Wolf settled into the chair beside her bed, his expression modest. I tracked your horse. It took 2 days, but the animal had not gone far. It was grazing in a meadow about 5 miles from where I found you, still wearing the saddle and your supplies. I thought you might want these things. They seemed important. Sophia clutched the satchel to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture. These journals were my father's life work. Losing them would have been like losing him all over again. You cannot know what this means to me. Black Wolf watched her quietly for a moment before speaking. Tell me about your father. Tell me why you risk your life alone in the wilderness to study plants. And so Sophia began to talk, really talk, for the first time since her ordeal began. She told Black Wolf about growing up in Boston, as the daughter of a botanist who was considered brilliant but impractical by his peers. She described how her father would take her on walks through parks and gardens, teaching her to see the world through the lens of scientific observation, to understand the intricate relationships between plants and soil and climate. She explained how consumption had taken him slowly, how he had spent his final years compiling notes for a comprehensive study of Rocky Mountain flora that he would never live to complete. Black Wolf listened without interruption, his dark eyes focused entirely on her face. When she finally fell silent, exhausted from talking, he nodded slowly. So you came west to finish what he started, to give his work the ending he could not give it himself. Sophia wiped at her eyes, surprised by how much emotion had surfaced in the telling. Yes, and also because I could not bear to stay in Boston, surrounded by people who thought my father was a fool for caring more about plants than about money or status. At least out here, my strangeness is just one more oddity among many. You are not strange. You are devoted. There is honor in finishing what another began, especially when that person was beloved to you. My grandmother would have understood your journey. She believed that knowledge carried responsibility, that learning something meant accepting the duty to preserve it and pass it on. Tell me about her. Your grandmother. You speak of her often. Black Wolf leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as memory took him. Her name was Walks with Thunder, and she was a medicine woman among our people, a keeper of the old knowledge. She taught me everything about healing plants, about reading signs in nature, about living in balance with the land rather than in conquest of it. When I was young, maybe 8 or 9 summers, she took me into the mountains for an entire season, just the 2 of us. She said a boy needed to understand that he was small compared to the world. That humility was the beginning of wisdom. Sophia found herself captivated by the gentleness in his voice, the clear love he held for this woman who had shaped him. Is she still alive? Black Wolf's expression darkened slightly. No, she died 6 winters ago, during the time of great sickness when many of our people fell to diseases brought by white settlers. She was old, and her body could not fight the fever. But even at the end, she was teaching. She told me that her death was part of the natural cycle, that fighting against it would be like fighting against winter or nightfall. She said the best way to honor her would be to use what she taught me to help others, regardless of whether they were Comanche or white or any other people. A heavy silence settled between them, filled with shared understanding of loss and the determination to carry forward the legacies of those who had gone before. Mourning Dove entered the cabin at that moment, breaking the quiet with her usual brisk efficiency. She assessed the scene with knowing eyes, noting the satchel in Sophia's lap and the expression on both their faces. Good, you are talking. Healing happens faster when the spirit is engaged along with the body. Sophia, I need to check your wounds, and then you will try standing today. Just for a moment, just to remind your leg what it is meant to do. Black Wolf, make yourself useful and prepare the willow bark tea. She will need it for the pain. The process of standing for the first time since the injury was more difficult than Sophia had anticipated. With Black Wolf supporting her on one side and Mourning Dove on the other, she managed to shift her weight onto her good leg and then, with excruciating slowness, to put the slightest pressure on her injured calf. The pain was immediate and intense, but beneath it she felt something else. The distant memory of what it meant to stand upright. To bear her own weight, Mourning Dove counted slowly in Comanche. And when she reached 10, they lowered Sophia back to the bed. The healer nodded with satisfaction. Good, tomorrow we will try for 20. By the end of next week, you will walk from the bed to the door. By the end of the month, you will walk from here to the garden. The body remembers what it knew before injury, but you must remind it with patience and persistence. Over the following days, Sophia's world began to expand beyond the confines of the cabin. She spent her waking hours sketching the plants Mourning Dove used in her medicines, documenting them with the same careful attention her father had taught her. Mourning Dove was initially skeptical of this activity, but when Sophia explained that she was creating a record that could help others understand the healing properties of these plants, the healer's attitude shifted to something approaching approval. You make medicine knowledge into words and pictures that can travel beyond one person's memory. This is good. Too much wisdom dies with the people who hold it, because no one thinks to preserve it in ways that can be shared. Perhaps your father's work and my grandmother's work are not so different after all. Black Wolf continued his daily visits, and gradually Sophia learned more about his life, about the difficult space he occupied between two worlds. His father had been a fur trader who fell in love with a Comanche woman during a trading expedition. Their marriage had been controversial on both sides, whites viewing it as degrading and Comanches seeing it as suspicious. When his father died, Black Wolf had been 15, old enough to choose which world he would belong to. I chose my mother's people because they accepted all of me, not just the parts that looked like them or spoke like them. Among the whites, I would always be the half-breed, the savage, someone to be tolerated, but never truly welcomed. Among the Comanche, I was simply Black Wolf, a young man learning to be a hunter and a healer. That does not mean it was easy. Some still questioned my loyalty, still wondered if white blood meant a white heart. But my grandmother stood for me, and in time, I proved myself through actions rather than words. Sophia listened to these stories with growing understanding of the courage it took to live authentically in a world that wanted people to choose sides, to fit into simple categories. She began to see her own journey west in a new light, recognizing that she too had been seeking a place where she could be herself without apology or explanation. On the 12th day of her recovery, a visitor arrived at Mourning Dove's cabin who would change the fragile peace Sophia had found. The man was in his 40s, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a silver watch chain visible across his vest and boots polished to an unusual shine. He introduced himself as Walter Grayson, a merchant from Fort Collins who had business dealings throughout the territory. Mourning Dove received him coolly, her body language making clear that his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. Grayson's eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail, lingering on Sophia with an expression that made her instinctively pull her blanket higher. When he spoke, his voice carried the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Pearson, I heard about your unfortunate accident from some of the trappers who passed through town. Terrible business, those traps. I have been trying to get the territorial government to regulate them for years. I came to see if there was anything you needed, anything I could provide to assist in your recovery." Sophia felt immediately wary, though she could not have explained why. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Grayson, but Mourning Dove has provided excellent care. I lack for nothing, Grayson smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. I am sure the healing woman has done her best with the resources available to her. However, I have connections to a proper doctor in Denver, trained in the latest medical techniques. I would be happy to arrange transport and cover all expenses. A young woman of your education and refinement surely deserves better than frontier remedies. Morning Dove's voice cut through the room like a blade. My remedies have kept her leg attached to her body and free from gangrene, which is more than your Denver doctors could promise. If you have business here, state it plainly. If you came only to insult my healing, you can leave. Grayson raised his hands in a gesture of placation, though his smile remained fixed. No insult intended, I assure you. I merely want to help. In fact, Miss Pearson, I wanted to discuss a business proposition with you. I understand you are conducting botanical research in the area. I have extensive land holdings throughout the territory, much of it unexplored. I would be willing to provide funding and protection for your work in exchange for documentation of any commercially valuable plants you discover. Sophia felt the weight of Black Wolf's gaze. Though he had not spoken since Grayson entered, she chose her words carefully. That is generous, Mr. Grayson, but my research is purely scientific in nature. I have no interest in commercial exploitation of plant species. Grayson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Perhaps you have not considered the practical realities of your situation. You are a woman alone in dangerous territory, with limited funds and no male protection. The land does not care about scientific purity, Miss Pearson. It cares about strength and resources. I am offering both. Black Wolf finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Grayson turn toward him. The lady has made her position clear. She needs no protection beyond what she has already found here. Your business is concluded. Grayson's expression hardened as he looked at Black Wolf, and Sophia saw something ugly flash across his face. I was not aware this savage had authority to speak for Miss Pearson. Surely a woman of breeding would not trust her affairs to a half-breed scout. The tension in the room became palpable. Morning Dove moved to stand beside her cousin, her hand resting on a knife at her belt. Sophia struggled to sit up straighter, anger overriding pain. Mr. Grayson, you will leave this cabin immediately. Black Wolf has more honor in his smallest action than you have shown in this entire conversation. I want nothing to do with your proposition or your company. Grayson's facade of civility cracked completely. You are making a mistake, Miss Pearson. Out here, people need allies with real power, not primitive healers and half-civilized Indians. When you realize that, and you will, do not expect my offer to stand. He left without further words, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the jars on Morning Dove's shelves. In the silence that followed, Sophia found herself shaking. Not from fear, but from the intensity of her anger and the recognition of something dangerous in Grayson's parting words. Morning Dove moved to secure the door, her movements deliberate. That man is poison. I have seen his type before. He comes offering help, but what he really wants is control. You were right to refuse him. Black Wolf remained standing, his body tense as he stared at the closed door. He is more than poison. He is dangerous. Men like that do not accept refusal gracefully. They see it as challenge, as insult to be answered. We will need to be careful. Sophia felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. What do you think he will do? Black Wolf turned to look at her, his expression serious. I do not know yet. But I know that he left here angry and humiliated. Such men always find ways to strike back. We must be watchful and prepared. That night, Sophia lay awake long after Morning Dove had extinguished the lamps. Through the window, she could see Black Wolf sitting on the porch, keeping watch in the darkness. She thought about Walter Grayson, about the threat implicit in his words, about how quickly safety could become danger. But she also thought about Black Wolf's steady presence, about Morning Dove's fierce protection. about the community she had found in this unlikely place, for the first time since leaving Boston. Sophia understood what it meant to have people who stood beside you, not because of obligation or expectation, but because they had chosen to do so. The thought filled her with both gratitude and fear, because now she had something to lose. People she cared about who might suffer because of their association with her. As dawn approached, Sophia finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that the confrontation with Grayson was only the beginning. That forces were already in motion that would test everything she and Black Wolf had found in each other. The question was no longer whether trouble would come, but when it would arrive and whether they would be ready to face it together. 3 days after Grayson's visit, the first sign of trouble came not with violence, but with whispers. Mourning Dove returned from the settlement one afternoon with a basket of supplies and a face dark with anger. She set the basket down harder than necessary, causing jars to rattle, and began unpacking with sharp, agitated movements that spoke of barely controlled fury. Sophia had progressed to the point where she could sit in a chair by the window, her injured leg propped on a cushioned stool. She watched Mourning Dove's unusual display of temper with growing concern. What happened in town? Mourning Dove turned to face her, eyes blazing. That snake Grayson has been spreading poison about you. He tells anyone who will listen that you are a fallen woman, that you came west fleeing scandal in Boston, that you have been living here in sin with my cousin. He says I am harboring immorality under the guise of healing, that Black Wolf seduced you while you were helpless and delirious with fever. Sophia felt her face flush hot with anger and shame. The lies were so audacious, so calculated to destroy her reputation and credibility, that for a moment she could not find words. When she finally spoke, her voice shook. Why would he do this? What does he gain from such cruelty? Mourning Dove came to sit beside her, her anger giving way to weary understanding. Men like Grayson cannot tolerate rejection, especially from women they consider beneath their status. You refused his help, refused his money, and worse, you did so in front of witnesses including an Indian man he views as inferior. He is reasserting his power the only way he knows how. By destroying your reputation so thoroughly that you will have no choice but to accept his protection. Black Wolf entered the cabin at that moment, having clearly overheard the conversation from outside. His face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched tight. The lies are spreading quickly. I heard them myself at the trading post. Some people are eager to believe the worst, especially about a white woman who chooses the company of Indians over her own kind. Sophia struggled to her feet, ignoring the protest from her injured leg. We must confront him directly. We must demand he retract these lies and apologize publicly. Mourning Dove shook her head firmly. That would only make things worse. Men like Grayson thrive on confrontation. He would twist your words, make you seem hysterical or desperate. No, we must be smarter than that. Black Wolf moved to help Sophia back into her chair, his touch gentle despite the anger radiating from him. There is something else you should know. Grayson has been buying up land around this area, pressuring small homesteaders to sell. Those who refuse have faced accidents, fires, livestock poisoning. Nothing that can be proven, but enough to make people afraid. Mourning Dove's cabin sits on land he has tried to purchase 3 times. This information sent ice through Sophia's veins. You think he might harm Mourning Dove because of me? Mourning Dove's expression was grim. I think he will use any excuse to drive me off this land. Your presence here simply gives him another weapon. But I will not be intimidated, and I will not ask you to leave. This is not your fault, Sophia. The blame belongs entirely to men who use power as a cudgel. That night, Sophia could not sleep. She lay in the darkness listening to the night sounds, the rustle of wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, the creak of floorboards as Black Wolf paced on the porch. She thought about the cruel efficiency of Grayson's attack, how he had weaponized society's prejudices against both her and those who had shown her kindness. In Boston, her reputation would have been her most valuable asset, the thing that determined her ability to work, to move freely, to be taken seriously. Out here, she had thought such concerns mattered less, but Grayson had proven that reputation was currency everywhere. The next morning brought news that escalated the situation beyond whispers and lies. A young boy arrived at the cabin, breathless from running, with a message that made Mourning Dove's face turn ashen. The settlement's magistrate, a man named Thurston who was known to be in Grayson's pocket, had issued a summons.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Sophia was to appear before him to answer questions about her activities and associations. Failure to appear would result in her arrest for vagrancy and moral turpitude. Black Wolf read the summons with barely controlled rage. This is Grayson's doing. Thurston does whatever that man tells him to do. They will use this hearing to publicly humiliate you, to force you to either leave the territory or accept Grayson's protection. Sophia felt fear settle into her bones. But beneath it, something else was rising. She had not survived a bear trap, infection, and fever, only to be destroyed by a corrupt merchant and his puppet magistrate. Then I will appear before this Thurston and answer his questions. I have done nothing wrong, nothing shameful. Let them try to prove otherwise. Mourning Dove looked at her with something approaching admiration. You are braver than I expected when Black Wolf first carried you here. But bravery alone will not be enough. We need strategy, and we need witnesses who will speak truth instead of Grayson's lies. Over the next 2 days, Mourning Dove and Black Wolf worked quietly to build Sophia's defense. They gathered testimony from the trappers who had originally set the trap and abandoned it, proving that Sophia's injury was the result of criminal negligence rather than any moral failing. They found the settlers who had purchased healing services from Mourning Dove and would attest to her skill and respectability. Most importantly, they convinced Father Miguel, the elderly Catholic priest who served the territory's scattered faithful, to testify about Black Wolf's character and Mourning Dove's contributions to the community. But gathering support also revealed the depth of Grayson's influence. Several people who had initially agreed to testify suddenly changed their minds, citing business concerns or family pressures. Others admitted frankly that they could not afford to make an enemy of Walter Grayson, that their livelihoods depended on staying in his good graces. The walls of power and money that protected men like Grayson became brutally visible. The hearing was set for a Saturday morning in the settlement's largest building, a combination church and meeting hall. Sophia prepared carefully. Wearing the one good dress Mourning Dove had helped her alter to accommodate her still healing leg. Black Wolf fashioned a crutch for her, carved from strong wood and padded with leather. As they made their way to the settlement, Sophia leaned heavily on both the crutch and Black Wolf's steady arm. The hall was packed with curious onlookers, some sympathetic but most simply eager for spectacle. Grayson sat in the front row, his expression smug and confident. Magistrate Thurston presided from behind a makeshift bench, his jowled face arranged in an approximation of judicial seriousness. The whole scene felt like a performance where the ending had already been written. Thurston called the proceedings to order and began with questions clearly designed to embarrass and intimidate. He asked Sophia about her family background, her reasons for coming west, her living arrangements before the injury. Each question was phrased to imply impropriety, to suggest that a respectable woman would not be in her position. Sophia answered calmly and directly, refusing to show the fear and anger churning inside her. Then Thurston turned his attention to Black Wolf, and the questions became openly hostile. He demanded to know Black Wolf's intentions toward Sophia, whether he had taken advantage of her helpless condition, whether Mourning Dove's cabin was truly a place of healing or something more sinister. The racist assumptions underlying each question made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Black Wolf stood to answer, his posture proud and his voice steady. "I found Miss Pearson dying in the forest. I brought her to my cousin, who is known throughout this territory as a skilled healer. I have treated her with the respect due to any person in need of help. If you are asking whether I have behaved with honor, the answer is yes. If you are asking whether I am ashamed of helping someone regardless of the color of her skin, the answer is no." Grayson stood suddenly, his voice dripping with false concern. "Magistrate Thurston, I think we must consider the larger implications here. We have a young woman of supposed good breeding, who has chosen to live among savages rather than accept help from her own people. We have an Indian who has inserted himself into her affairs under questionable circumstances. This situation threatens the moral fabric of our community." Father Miguel rose from his seat in the back, his aged voice carrying surprising power. "I have lived in this territory for 30 years, Walter Grayson. I have seen true immorality, and it wears expensive suits and speaks with silver tongue. Black Wolf is one of the most honorable men I know, and Morning Dove has saved more lives than you have coins in your purse. If this hearing is truly about morality, perhaps we should examine why a wealthy merchant feels threatened by a young woman's independence." The crowd murmured at this, and Thurston banged his gavel for order. Several other witnesses stepped forward then, emboldened by the priest's courage. A trapper testified about the dangerous abandoned traps littering the forest. A settler woman spoke of how Morning Dove had saved her child from scarlet fever when the town doctor had given up hope. One by one, they dismantled Grayson's narrative of scandal and impropriety, but Grayson was not finished. He produced documents claiming that Sophia owed money to a Boston creditor, that she had left Massachusetts fleeing debts. The papers looked official, bearing seals and signatures, though Sophia knew immediately they were forgeries. She had no debts, had paid her father's medical bills before leaving Boston. But proving forgery would take time and resources she did not have. Thurston seized on these documents with obvious relief, grateful for any justification to rule in Grayson's favor. "It seems, Miss Pearson, that you have not been entirely forthcoming about your circumstances. Until these financial matters are resolved and proper guarantees made for your moral conduct, I am ordering you to leave this territory within 30 days. The unfairness of it struck Sophia like a physical blow. She struggled to stand, her voice rising above the crowd's reaction. You have decided nothing based on justice or truth. This entire proceeding has been a performance orchestrated by Walter Grayson to punish me for refusing his control. Those documents are forgeries, and everyone in this room knows it." Thurston's face reddened with anger. "You will not address this court with such disrespect. My ruling stands. 30 days, Miss Pearson, or you will be forcibly removed." Black Wolf moved to Sophia's side, his presence solid and reassuring, even as everything seemed to collapse around them. Morning Dove pushed through the crowd to join them, her face set in determined lines. Father Miguel approached as well, placing a weathered hand on Sophia's shoulder. The four of them stood together as the crowd dispersed. A small island of solidarity in a sea of injustice outside the hall. Grayson approached with two men Sophia did not recognize. Rough-looking individuals who carried themselves like hired muscle. His smile was triumphant and cruel. "Miss Pearson, I trust you now understand the reality of your situation. However, I am not without mercy. My original offer stands. Accept my patronage, work under my direction, and this unpleasantness can all disappear. Refuse, and I will ensure you are run out of this territory with nothing but the clothes on your back." Sophia met his gaze without flinching, channeling every ounce of her father's stubborn pride. "I would rather leave with nothing than accept anything from a man who deals in lies and corruption. You may have bought the magistrate, Mr. Grayson, but you have not bought me." Grayson's expression darkened dangerously. "You will regret this defiance. I promise you that." Black Wolf stepped forward, placing himself between Sophia and Grayson. "The lady has given her answer. You should leave now before this conversation becomes something you truly regret." The two hired men moved closer, hands drifting toward weapons at their belts. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring, violence hanging in the air like an approaching storm. But Father Miguel's voice cut through the moment, sharp and commanding despite his age. "There will be no bloodshed on church grounds, gentlemen. Walter, take your men and go. This matter is not settled, but it will not be settled today with fists and guns." For a long moment, Grayson seemed ready to push the confrontation further. But the presence of witnesses and the priest's authority made him reconsider. He stepped back, though his eyes promised future retribution. 30 days, Miss Pearson. The clock is ticking as Grayson and his men departed. Sophia felt her legs begin to shake, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the hearing finally draining away. Black Wolf caught her before she could fall, lifting her into his arms despite her protests. Mourning Dove and Father Miguel flanked them as they made their way back toward the cabin. A protective escort through a settlement that suddenly felt hostile and dangerous. That night, as Sophia lay exhausted in her bed, she heard voices on the porch. Black Wolf and Mourning Dove were talking in low, urgent tones, discussing options and strategies. Through the window, she could see the stars scattered across the vast western sky. The same stars her father had taught her to navigate by when she was a child. She thought about how far she had come from Boston, about everything she had survived, and about the impossible choice now facing her. She could leave the territory as ordered, abandoning her father's work and the community she had found here. She could accept Grayson's patronage and lose her independence entirely. Or she could stay and fight, risking not only her own future, but the safety of those who had protected her. Each option carried its own cost, its own form of defeat. But as she listened to Black Wolf and Mourning Dove planning her defense, as she remembered Father Miguel's courage and the witnesses who had spoken truth despite their fear, Sophia realized something important. She was no longer alone in this fight. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from defying Walter Grayson's power, she would face them surrounded by people who had chosen to stand beside her. The question was no longer whether she would fight, but how. And in the darkness of that uncertain night, as the first hints of a plan began to form in her mind, Sophia understood that sometimes the only way forward was through the fire, not around it. The next 30 days would determine not just her future in the territory, but the kind of person she would become in the face of injustice and impossible odds. The morning after the hearing, Sophia woke to find Black Wolf already gone and Mourning Dove preparing for travel. The healer moved with purposeful efficiency, packing supplies into saddlebags and checking the loads on 2 horses tethered outside. When she noticed Sophia watching from the doorway, leaning heavily on her crutch, Mourning Dove's expression softened slightly. Black Wolf rode out before dawn. He has gone to speak with the territorial marshal in Denver, a man who owes him a debt from years past. If anyone can investigate Grayson's forgeries and land dealings, it would be Marshal Hendricks. But the journey is 3 days each way, which means we must hold our ground here for at least a week. Sophia felt hope flicker despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "You think the marshal will help?" Mourning Dove secured the last strap on the saddlebag and turned to face her fully. "Marshal Hendricks is one of the few lawmen in this territory who cannot be bought. He is also one of the few white men who has never treated my cousin as less than human. If Black Wolf asks for his help, he will come. But that does not mean Grayson will wait patiently for justice to arrive. We must be prepared for him to act first." The warning proved prescient. That very afternoon, 2 of Grayson's men appeared at the cabin's edge, not approaching directly but making their presence known. They sat on horseback just beyond the property line, watching the cabin with undisguised menace. Mourning Dove observed them from the window, her hand resting on the rifle she kept near the door. "They want us to feel hunted, to know we are being watched. Grayson is applying pressure, waiting for us to crack. We will not give him that satisfaction. The siege, for that was what it became, lasted 3 days. Grayson's men maintained their vigil in shifts, ensuring that someone was always watching. They made no move to approach or threaten directly, staying just within the bounds of legal observation. But their presence accomplished its goal, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Mourning Dove could not tend to her garden or gather herbs without being watched. Sophia could not sit by the window without seeing those silent sentinels. Father Miguel visited on the second day, bringing food and news from the settlement. His weathered face was grave as he shared what he had learned. Grayson has been spreading word that you two are dangerous, that Mourning Dove practices dark magic and has bewitched you. He is building support for forcible removal, claiming it is for your own protection and the community's safety. Several families have already signed a petition. Sophia felt sick. How can people believe such nonsense? The priest's expression was sad but knowing. People believe what confirms their fears and prejudices. They see an Indian woman living apart from both communities, using methods they do not understand. They see a white woman choosing that company over her own kind. It is easier to believe you are bewitched than to question their own assumptions about how the world should work. That night, Sophia and Mourning Dove sat together by the fire, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Sophia found the courage to voice what had been troubling her. You should tell me to leave. This is your home, your life, and I am bringing danger to your door. I would not blame you if you wanted me gone. Mourning Dove looked at her with something between amusement and exasperation. You think I have lived this long without making enemies? You think Grayson is the first powerful man who wanted my land or resented my independence? I chose to help you because it was right, and I choose to stand beside you now for the same reason. If you leave, he wins. If you stay and fight, at least we have a chance to show that power and money do not always prevail. The words strengthened Sophia's resolve, but they could not entirely dispel the fear. She lay awake that night listening to every sound, imagining threats in every creak and rustle. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of being chased through endless forests, of traps hidden beneath every step. On the 4th day, Black Wolf returned with Marshal Hendricks. The lawman was in his 50s, grizzled and serious, with eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as Sophia explained the situation, examining the forged documents with professional attention. When she finished, he nodded slowly. These are forgeries, and poor ones at that. The seals are wrong. The signatures do not match the handwriting samples I have from the Boston courts. More importantly, I have been investigating Walter Grayson for 2 years now. Land fraud, intimidation, possible involvement in several suspicious fires. The problem has always been proof and witnesses willing to testify. If you are willing to make a formal complaint, Miss Pearson, this might be the opening I need. Relief flooded through Sophia. I will testify to everything. The lies, the forgeries, the harassment. Marshal Hendricks held up a hand. Understand what you are committing to. Grayson has money and connections. Taking him to trial will be difficult and dangerous. He will fight back with everything he has. Are you prepared for that? Sophia thought of her father, of the work he had left unfinished, of the community that had protected her despite the cost. She thought of Black Wolf sitting vigil through her fevered nights, of Mourning Dove's fierce protection, of Father Miguel's courage. I am prepared. I will not run from this. The marshal's plan was methodical and careful. He would return to Denver to file formal charges and gather additional evidence. In the meantime, Sophia would remain under protective custody at Mourning Dove's cabin, with Black Wolf and several deputized men providing security. The territorial judge would be summoned for a proper trial, one that could not be corrupted by Grayson's influence. But Grayson learned of the marshal's involvement before Hendricks could leave the territory. That evening, as the sun set in flames of orange and red, a group of 15 men rode up to Mourning Dove's cabin. Grayson sat at their head, his face twisted with rage barely contained. Marshal Hendricks stepped onto the porch to meet them, his badge visible and his hand resting casually on his gun. "That is far enough, Grayson. You and your men will turn around and leave this property immediately." Grayson's voice carried across the yard, loud and theatrical. "I am here on behalf of concerned citizens who fear for Miss Pearson's safety and moral welfare. We have come to escort her to proper lodgings in town, where she can be cared for by respectable people." The marshal's expression remained impassive. "Miss Pearson is under the protection of territorial law. She has filed formal complaints against you for fraud, forgery, and harassment. Any attempt to remove her will be considered kidnapping and assault on a federal witness. I suggest you consider your next actions very carefully." The standoff stretched taut as Grayson weighed his options. His men shifted uneasily, some clearly uncomfortable with the escalation. Several recognized that attacking a federal marshal would bring consequences even Grayson's money could not erase. But Grayson himself seemed beyond reason, driven by wounded pride and fury. "You are protecting criminals, Hendricks. That Indian witch has poisoned Miss Pearson's mind, and that half-breed scout has taken advantage of her vulnerability. I am within my rights as a citizen to intervene." Black Wolf stepped out onto the porch beside the marshal, his presence calm but unmistakably threatening. "You speak of rights while trampling on them. You speak of concern while spreading lies. Every word from your mouth confirms that you are exactly what Miss Pearson accused you of being. A bully who uses power to destroy anyone who defies you." Grayson's hand moved toward his gun, and for a heartbeat, violence seemed inevitable. But Father Miguel emerged from inside the cabin, moving to stand between the two groups. His voice rang out with surprising authority. "Enough, Walter Grayson. I have known you since you came to this territory 10 years ago. I have watched you build your fortune on the backs of desperate people, watched you crush anyone who stood in your way. But this time you have pushed too far. These people have broken no laws and violated no morals, except the twisted ones you have invented to justify your cruelty. In the eyes of God and decent society, you are the one who should be ashamed." The priest's words seemed to break something in the tension. Several of Grayson's men began backing their horses away, unwilling to participate further. Others looked at each other uncertainly, perhaps seeing their employer clearly for the first time. Grayson himself seemed to deflate slightly, realizing he had lost the moral high ground entirely. Marshal Hendricks seized the moment. "Grayson, you have a choice. You can leave peacefully now and face trial like a civilized man, or you can force a confrontation that will end with you and your men in chains. Either way, your days of terrorizing this territory are finished." For a long moment, Grayson sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of impotent rage. Then he wheeled his mount around and spurred away without another word, his remaining men following in disorganized retreat. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the evening, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Inside the cabin afterward, Sophia collapsed into a chair, her injured leg throbbing and her whole body shaking with released tension. Black Wolf knelt beside her, checking her bandages with gentle hands. His dark eyes met hers with an expression that held relief, concern, and something deeper that made her heart stutter. "You were brave today. You stood against a powerful man and won." "Not many people have that kind of courage," Sophia managed a weak laugh. "I did not feel brave. I felt terrified." Mourning Dove brought tea, pressing the warm cup into Sophia's hands. "Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is acting rightly despite the fear. You have proven yourself stronger than I first believed possible." The trial took place 3 weeks later in Denver, presided over by a territorial judge known for his incorruptibility. Marshal Hendricks presented overwhelming evidence of Grayson's crimes, including testimony from numerous victims who finally felt safe enough to speak. The forged documents were exposed, the land fraud documented, the pattern of intimidation established beyond doubt. Sophia testified clearly and calmly, describing everything that had happened since Grayson's first visit to Mourning Dove's cabin. Grayson was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. His assets were seized to compensate his victims, and several of his accomplices, including Magistrate Thurston, faced their own legal consequences. The trial became famous throughout the territory as an example of justice prevailing over corruption, though those who lived through it knew how narrowly that victory had been won. By the time Sophia returned to Mourning Dove's cabin, summer had arrived in full glory. Her leg had healed enough that she walked with only a slight limp, and the scars had faded to thin white lines. She spent her days cataloging plants and completing her father's research. But she spent her evenings with Black Wolf, learning about the land from someone who understood it in ways no book could teach. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Black Wolf spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I would like you to stay. Not just until your work is finished, but longer. Perhaps always, if that is something you might want." Sophia turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his calm exterior. "In Boston, my life was prescribed by rules and expectations I never chose. Out here, I have found something I never knew I was searching for. Freedom, yes, but also purpose and community." And she paused, meeting his eyes directly. "And you?" "I would very much like to stay," Black Wolf smiled, a rare full expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Then stay. We will face whatever comes together, as we have already done. The land is wide and the work is endless, but it is better shared." Mourning Dove watched from the cabin doorway, her expression satisfied. She had seen this developing between them for weeks, the careful way they moved around each other, the looks that lingered just a moment too long. It pleased her to see her cousin finding happiness after years of solitude, and to see Sophia discovering that strength and independence did not require isolation. As autumn approached, Sophia established a permanent camp near Mourning Dove's cabin, a place that served as both research station and home. She divided her time between documenting plant species and helping Mourning Dove with her healing work, discovering that the two pursuits complemented each other beautifully. Her father's journals were finally completed and published, with a dedication that acknowledged both his vision and the community that had made its fulfillment possible. Black Wolf continued his work as a scout and hunter, but he always returned to the cabin, to the place that had become home in ways his wandering life had never been. He taught Sophia to track game, to read weather in the sky, to move through the forest as part of it rather than as an intruder. She taught him about scientific classification and documentation, about preserving knowledge for future generations. The territorial newspapers eventually picked up Sophia's story, portraying her as a symbol of frontier courage and independence. She received letters from young women across the country asking how they too might pursue scientific careers in defiance of social expectations. She answered each one honestly, describing both the freedom and the hardships, encouraging them to find their own paths rather than simply following hers. Years later, when Sophia looked back on that terrible day when the trap closed around her leg, she understood it as the moment when her real life began. Everything before had been preparation, and everything after had been transformation. The scars on her leg reminded her of fragility and strength existing together, of how close death had come and how fiercely she had chosen life. She thought often of Walter Grayson, not with hatred, but with a kind of sad understanding. He had represented everything wrong with unchecked power, but he had also inadvertently given her the chance to discover who she truly was. In trying to destroy her independence, he had forced her to claim it more completely than she might have otherwise. On a crisp autumn evening, as Sophia and Black Wolf sat together watching their first child play in the fallen leaves, She felt the completeness of her journey. She had come west seeking to finish her father's work, but she had found so much more. A home that was not defined by walls or ownership, but by the people who shared it. A love that grew from mutual respect and shared struggle rather than social expectation. A life that was entirely her own, built from courage and choice. Black Wolf reached for her hand, his touch as steady and reassuring as it had been that first day when he pulled her from the trap. Sometimes I think about how easily we might never have met. If I had ridden a different path that day, if the ravens had not circled. Sophia squeezed his hand, watching their daughter chase a butterfly through the golden afternoon light. But you did ride that path, and the ravens did circle, and we did meet. Perhaps some things are meant to be, not because they are predestined, but because when they happen, they feel so completely right that we cannot imagine any other way. Morning Dove joined them on the porch, settling into her rocking chair with a satisfied sigh. She looked at the scene before her, at the family that had formed in the wake of crisis and courage, and nodded to herself. "This is what healing looks like," she said quietly. "Not just mended flesh and bone, but mended spirits finding their place in the world. You have both traveled far from where you began." As the sun set and the first stars appeared, Sophia reflected on the truth of those words. She had indeed traveled far, not just in distance but in understanding. The wilderness that had once seemed so dangerous now felt like home. The culture that had once seemed so foreign now enriched her life in countless ways. The man who had saved her body had also awakened her heart. And somewhere in the mountains beyond, the land continued its ancient rhythms. Indifferent to human drama, but somehow holding space for all of it. The forests where Sophia had nearly died now represented life and possibility. The trap that had caught her leg had also freed her from a life half-lived. The pain that had nearly broken her had instead revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. In the end, Sophia understood that her story was not really about rescue at all. It was about the courage to accept help when it was offered. The strength to stand against injustice, even when the cost seemed too high. And the wisdom to recognize that the life we think we want is sometimes far smaller than the life we deserve. Black Wolf had saved her from the trap, but she had saved herself from the limitations she had accepted without question. As night fell completely and the family moved inside, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight against the darkness. It stood as a beacon of what was possible when people chose connection over division. When they honored both tradition and innovation. When they built their lives on truth rather than on the lies that powerful men told to maintain control. And in that light, in that warmth, in that hard-won peace, Sophia finally understood what her father had been searching for all along. Not just knowledge of plants and ecosystems, but understanding of how life persists and adapts and thrives against all odds. She had become living proof of that truth, and the work she would do in the years ahead would honor both his legacy and her own hard-earned wisdom. The story that began with a scream in the wilderness ended with laughter in a home built from courage and love. And though challenges would come in the years ahead, as they always do, Sophia faced them with the knowledge that she was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped into that trap. She was someone who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. Someone who had found her place in the world by refusing to accept the place others tried to assign her. 2 years had passed since the trial that brought Walter Grayson to justice. And the wounds, both visible and invisible, had begun to heal in ways that went deeper than mere flesh. Sophia stood in the doorway of the cabin she and Black Wolf had built just beyond Morning Dove's property, watching the morning sun illuminate the valley below. At 23, she carried herself with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to her younger self. The frightened girl who had screamed in agony while trapped in iron jaws. The cabin was modest but sturdy. Built with Black Wolf's hands and designed with Sophia's input to accommodate both living space and a small workroom where she could document her botanical research. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, their earthy scent mingling with the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. Her father's journals lay open on the work table, surrounded by her own growing collection of sketches and pressed specimens. Behind her, she heard Black Wolf moving about, preparing for the day's hunting expedition. They had settled into a rhythm over these 2 years, a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. They were not yet married in the eyes of either white law or Comanche tradition, choosing instead to let their relationship develop without the pressure of formal declarations. But everyone who knew them understood they belonged together. Two souls who had found each other in the crucible of crisis. Morning Dove appeared on the path leading to the cabin, moving with her characteristic brisk efficiency despite the early hour. She carried a basket covered with cloth, and Sophia knew without looking that it would contain fresh bread and whatever medicinal supplies she thought Sophia might need. The older woman had become not just a healer and teacher, but something like family, the closest thing to a mother Sophia had known since childhood. "You are up early." "The garden needs tending already," Sophia smiled, accepting the basket and gesturing for Morning Dove to join her on the porch. "Not the garden. A visitor is coming today. A young woman from back east who wrote to me months ago asking if she could study my research methods. I agreed, though I am not certain what kind of teacher I will be." Morning Dove settled into the chair Sophia offered, her dark eyes appraising. "You have learned much in 2 years. More importantly, you have lived through struggle and emerged stronger. That is the best qualification for teaching others who seek their own paths." "What is this young woman's story?" "Her name is Catherine Wells, from Philadelphia. She read the preliminary article I published about medicinal plants of the territory. Her letter suggested she is fleeing something, though she did not say what directly. I recognized the tone. It was how I might have written before I came west." Morning Dove nodded knowingly. "Then she will find what she needs here, or she will discover it was not what she thought she was seeking. Either way, the journey will teach her. We will make room for her." Black Wolf emerged from the cabin, his rifle slung across his back and his leather pack prepared for several days in the high country. He paused beside Sophia, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture of affection that had become familiar. "The elk herds are moving to higher elevations. I should return in 3 days, perhaps 4. You will be well here with Morning Dove." Sophia covered his hand with her own, feeling the calluses and strength there. "We will be fine. Hunt safely and come back to me, always," he said simply, and the single word carried the weight of a promise that needed no elaboration. After Black Wolf departed, Sophia and Morning Dove worked together in the garden, tending the medicinal plants they cultivated alongside vegetables for eating. This had become Sophia's second education, learning not just to identify plants in the wild, but to understand their cultivation, their proper harvest times, the ways different soil and water conditions affected their potency. Morning Dove was a patient teacher, explaining not just the practical aspects, but the philosophy behind Comanche healing practices. "The plants give themselves to us, but we must approach them with respect. You do not simply take what you want. You ask permission, you harvest only what you need, you leave enough for the plant to continue thriving." This is not superstition. It is practical wisdom learned over generations. Sophia had filled 3 journals with such teachings, determined to document this knowledge before it was lost. Her published article had generated more interest than she had anticipated, and several universities had written requesting more detailed information. She was negotiating with a publisher about expanding the work into a full book, though she insisted that Morning Dove be listed as a co-author, a suggestion the healer had initially resisted. "My knowledge was given to me by my grandmother and her grandmother before her. It feels wrong to claim ownership by putting my name on white man's paper," but Sophia had persisted. "That is exactly why your name must be there, so people understand this knowledge has sources, that it belongs to a tradition and a people who deserve recognition and respect." Otherwise, some white scholar will eventually publish similar information and claim it as his own discovery. Mourning Dove had eventually agreed, understanding the strategic importance, even if the concept still felt foreign to her worldview. Catherine Wells arrived in the early afternoon, riding a tired horse and carrying saddlebags that looked well-traveled. She was perhaps 19, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that held both determination and uncertainty. When she dismounted, Sophia noticed the slight hesitation in her movements, the way she favored her left side. "Miss Pearson?" Catherine's voice was steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to see me. The journey was longer than I anticipated. But I am here now and ready to learn whatever you are willing to teach." Sophia felt an immediate kinship with this young woman, recognizing something of her own younger self in that mixture of courage and vulnerability. "Please call me Sophia. Come inside and rest. We can talk about your studies after you have recovered from your journey." Over the next hours, as Catherine settled into the small guest space they had prepared, her story emerged in fragments. She was the daughter of a prominent Philadelphia doctor who had dismissed her interest in medicine as inappropriate for a woman. She had read Sophia's article and been struck not just by the botanical content, but by the implicit message that a woman could pursue scientific work in the West, far from the constraints of Eastern society. She had left home against her family's wishes, carrying only what money she had saved and a letter of introduction from a sympathetic university professor. Mourning Dove examined Catherine with the same thorough attention she gave all patients, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she protected her left side, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just travel fatigue. The healer asked questions in her direct way, cutting through social niceties to understand the truth of Catherine's condition. "You have an old injury. Ribs, I think. That did not heal properly. And you do not sleep well." "Nightmares, yes." Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "How did you know?" Mourning Dove's expression softened with understanding. "Because I have treated many women who carry similar wounds. You ran from something, and you are still running in your mind even though your body has stopped. We will treat both. The ribs can be helped with wrapping and medicine. The nightmares require different healing." That evening, as the three women sat together preparing the evening meal, Sophia found herself reflecting on the strange circularity of life. 2 years ago, she had been the one arriving broken and desperate, saved by strangers who became family. Now she was in a position to offer similar refuge to another young woman fleeing her own demons. The responsibility felt both humbling and empowering. Catherine watched them work together with obvious fascination. "You and Black Wolf, you are not married in the traditional sense, yet you live as partners. And Mourning Dove, you practice medicine without any official credential from white institutions, yet people trust your healing. How did you find the courage to live outside society's expectations?" Sophia exchanged glances with Mourning Dove before answering. "I did not set out to be courageous. I simply reached a point where the cost of conforming became greater than the cost of refusing. The bear trap that nearly killed me also freed me from caring what Boston society thought of my choices. Sometimes we need such dramatic breaks to give ourselves permission to be who we truly are." Mourning Dove added her own perspective. "The white world loves rules and boundaries, boxes to put people in. My world understands that life is more fluid, that people contain multitudes. I am Comanche, and I use white medicine when it works. I am a woman, and I hold authority in healing. I live between worlds because that is where I am most useful. You do not need courage so much as clarity about what matters most to you." Catherine absorbed these words with visible hunger, as if she had been starving for permission to imagine a different kind of life. Over the following days, she proved to be an eager and capable student. She learned quickly, asked intelligent questions, and showed genuine respect for both scientific method and traditional knowledge. Sophia found unexpected satisfaction in teaching. in passing along not just information, but a way of seeing the world. They spent mornings in the field, documenting plant species and learning to identify medicinal varieties. Afternoons were dedicated to preparation and preservation techniques, the careful work of drying, grinding, and storing herbs for maximum potency. Evenings involved study of Sophia's journals and discussion of how to bridge different knowledge systems without diminishing either. When Black Wolf returned from his hunting expedition, he brought not just game meat, but news from the wider territory. A railroad survey team had been spotted in the valley, marking routes for potential expansion. More settlers were arriving weekly, claiming land and establishing farms. The world that Sophia had found 2 years ago was already changing, being transformed by the same forces of progress and civilization she had once fled. That night, lying beside Black Wolf in the darkness of their cabin, Sophia voiced her concerns. What if everything changes? What if the railroad brings so many people that this place becomes just another version of what I left behind? Black Wolf was quiet for a moment before responding. Change is like the seasons. You cannot stop it, you can only adapt. But the land is vast, and there will always be wild places for those who seek them. And the knowledge we are preserving, that Morning Dove is teaching you, and you are teaching Catherine, that cannot be taken away by railroads or settlers. It lives in our actions and our choices. Sophia found comfort in this perspective, in the long view that came from a people who had weathered centuries of change. She thought about her father's journals, about the work she was building on his foundation, about Catherine sleeping in the next room with dreams of a future she was just beginning to imagine. Perhaps the real legacy was not in preserving things exactly as they were, but in adapting and evolving while holding on to what mattered most. 2 weeks into Catherine's stay, Morning Dove declared her ribs sufficiently healed and shifted focus to addressing the deeper wounds. She taught Catherine the same breathing exercises she had taught Sophia during her recovery, techniques for managing pain and fear. She shared stories of other women who had survived trauma and rebuilt their lives, creating a tapestry of resilience that made Catherine's own struggles feel less isolating. One evening, Catherine finally spoke about what she had fled. An engagement to a man chosen by her father, a man whose temper had revealed itself in private moments before the wedding. The broken ribs had come from being shoved down a staircase, an accident everyone had agreed to call it, though Catherine knew better. She had realized that marriage would mean a lifetime of such accidents, and she had chosen to run instead. Sophia listened without judgment, recognizing the courage it took to leave safety and certainty, even when that safety was an illusion. You made the right choice. Whatever hardships you face out here, at least they are honest hardships, not cruelty disguised as love. Morning Dove nodded agreement. You have joined a long tradition of women who refuse to accept what they are told they must accept. This tradition is stronger than any man's anger or society's disapproval. We stand together. As autumn approached and the aspens began their transformation to gold, Catherine prepared to continue her journey. She had received acceptance to a medical program in Denver, one of the few willing to admit women students. Sophia and Morning Dove had provided letters of recommendation, and Catherine carried copies of their research along with her own careful notes from weeks of intensive study. On the morning of her departure, the 3 women stood together outside the cabin, the mountains rising behind them in layers of blue and purple. Catherine embraced first Morning Dove, then Sophia. Her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Thank you for showing me what is possible, for teaching me that strength and knowledge can take forms the world does not yet recognize. I will carry this with me always, Sophia smiled, remembering similar farewells 2 years ago, though hers had been from a world she was fleeing rather than from one she had found. You carry it forward. That is how this work continues, not through one person, but through a community of people committed to truth and healing. After Catherine rode away, Sophia and Mourning Dove stood watching until she disappeared from view. Black Wolf emerged from the cabin to join them, and the three stood together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The scar on Sophia's leg had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. She touched the place absently, feeling the slight ridge of healed tissue beneath her fingertips. The trap that had caught her seemed like something from another lifetime, though only 2 years had passed. But those 2 years had contained more growth and change than the entire 21 years that preceded them. She thought about who she had been, the frightened girl following her father's dream without fully understanding her own. She thought about who she was becoming, a woman who had found her voice and her purpose in the most unexpected place. And she thought about the future, uncertain but filled with possibility. Black Wolf's hand found hers, warm and solid. Mourning Dove hummed a quiet melody, something ancient and knowing. And Sophia understood that this moment, standing between the healer who had saved her life and the man who had found her when she was lost, this was exactly where she was meant to be. The wilderness had nearly killed her, but it had also given her life. The pain had been terrible, but it had led to transformation she could never have imagined. And now, 2 years later, she was strong enough to offer others what had been offered to her: sanctuary, knowledge, and the permission to become whoever they were brave enough to be. As they turned back toward the cabin, Sophia felt profound gratitude settle over her like a blessing. For the pain that had led to growth, for the strangers who had become family, for the land that had tested and accepted her, for the work that gave her days meaning, and most of all, for the courage to say yes when life offered her a second chance, even though accepting it meant becoming someone entirely new. The story that had begun with a scream in the forest had become something quieter but no less powerful. A story of healing and growth, of found family and chosen paths, of wounds that became wisdom. And as the door closed behind them and the cabin filled with warmth and light and the sounds of life continuing, Sophia knew that this was not an ending at all, but simply the next chapter in a story that was still being written.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.